Chapter 1. A New Beginning. The stagecoach lurched to a stop, its wheels crunching over the half-frozen dirt road. A gust of wind howled across the Dakota plains, whipping up dust and the scent of damp wood and livestock. Clara Winslow gripped the handle of her travel trunk as the door swung open. A bitter gust swept inside, biting through the heavy fabric of her wool cloak and making her shiver. She hesitated for just a moment before stepping down. Her heeled boots sank into the cold, packed earth, a stark contrast to the paved streets of Boston she had left behind. The town before her, Bismarck, Dakota Territory, was nothing like the grand city she once called home. No towering buildings. No carriages lined up in neat rows. No street lamps illuminating fine cobblestone. Instead, a single dusty road ran through the heart of town, flanked by rough-hewn wooden buildings. A general store with barrels of dry goods stacked outside. A blacksmith's shop, the scent of burning coal thick in the air. A saloon with a half-broken sign creaking in the wind, swinging from rusted chains. A few bundled-up townsfolk milled about, but most stopped to stare at her. Clara swallowed her nerves and squared her shoulders. She had known this would be different. She had wanted it to be different. Lord Almighty, that's a fine bit of lace she's wearing, someone muttered near the general store. She won't last a week. Another voicemail. Gruff remarked. Clara ignored them and lifted her chin, adjusting her gloves. Her travel dress, navy blue with delicate embroidery, had seemed sensible in Boston. Here, among men in dust-covered coats and women in homespun prairie dresses, she may as well have been wearing a ballroom gown. Miss Winslow. She turned toward the voice, spotting a tall, wiry woman in a dark grey dress, her silver hair twisted into a severe bun. Mrs. Hawthorne. The woman studied her with sharp blue eyes, lips pressed in a thin line, as if she already regretted offering Clara the position. Yes, ma'am, Clara answered, straightening. I trust I haven't kept you waiting long. Mrs. Hawthorne sniffed. Stagecoach is on time, for once. That's a miracle. Usually it's late or not at all. She gave Clara a once-over, her eyes narrowing. You'll want to get rid of that bonnet. The wind'll steal it first chance it gets. Clara reached up self-consciously, her gloved fingers brushing against the velvet ribbons. I'll keep that in mind. A tall man in a deputy's badge stepped forward then, his boots scuffing against the dirt road. He had a square jaw, sandy blonde hair, and a well-worn revolver holstered at his hip. His stance was casual, but there was something assessing in his hazel gaze. Deputy Tom Ellison, he introduced himself, tipping his hat. You're the new schoolteacher, I take it. I am, Clara said. Well, welcome to Bismarck. His voice was deep, carrying the authority of a lawman. I'll get right to it. This land is rough, Miss Winslow. You come from Boston, I hear? Clara nodded. Ellison exhaled, rocking back on his heels. This ain't Boston. I gathered as much, she replied dryly. A ghost of a smile crossed the deputy's face before vanishing just as fast. There's folks in town who'll help you if needed, but I'll be frank, we got our fair share of trouble here. Outlaws ride through now and then. Wild animals aren't uncommon. Winter's worse than you're used to. You'll want to stay close to town unless you got an escort. Clara didn't balk. I appreciate the warning, deputy, but I'm not afraid of hard work. Mrs. Hawthorne gave a short, approving nod. We'll see about that. Ellison's gaze softened just a fraction. Fair enough. Just be careful, Miss Winslow. Not everyone out here is friendly. A gust of wind cut between the buildings, chilling Clara to the bone. Somewhere down the street, a black stallion pawed at the frozen ground, his rider barely visible in the shifting light. A broad-shouldered man, hat pulled low, sat astride the beast, unmoving. Clara felt the weight of his gaze for a brief moment before he turned his horse and disappeared down the road. She shivered not just from the cold. Her new life had begun, and something told her it wouldn't be anything like she had expected. The Gold Nugget Saloon wasn't a place for a lady. Clara Winslow knew that before she ever set foot inside. She'd barely been in Bismarck an hour, yet already circumstances had forced her into unfamiliar territory. Mrs. Hawthorne had been clear her lodging wouldn't be ready until the morning. For now, she'd have to make do with a hot meal at the only establishment still serving at this late hour. The moment she stepped inside, the thick scent of pipe smoke, whiskey, and unwashed men wrapped around her like a heavy wool blanket. The saloon was dimly lit by oil lamps, their flickering glow casting long shadows over the wooden walls. Rough-looking men huddled around scarred tables, their voices a low rumble over the clink of poker chips and the occasional burst of laughter. A barkeep wiped down the counter, his sleeves rolled to the elbows, the movement slow and practiced. In the far corner, a tired-looking woman in a faded dress played a soft melody on an out-of-tune piano. Clara stiffened. She didn't belong here. Heads turned as she crossed the threshold, her dark blue traveling dress too fine, too crisp for the rugged frontier. A few of the men cast speculative glances her way, while others openly gawked. She held her chin high, pretending not to notice. "I tell ya, he ain't been the same since the accident." The low whisper snagged Clara's attention as she stepped toward an empty table near the back. Two men sat at a nearby poker table, their voices carrying despite their hushed tones. "You talking about Calloway? Ain't nobody else it could be," the first man grumbled, tossing a coin onto the pile between them. "Fella used to be something damn near untouchable with a rifle, at the best heard this side of the Missouri. Then that fire took near half his stock and his face." Clara stilled, pretending to busy herself adjusting the folds of her cloak. The second man shook his head. "Ain't just the fire. That woman of his ran off soon after, didn't she?" "Aye. Left him to rot. Can't say I blame her. Ain't a man alive could come back from what he lost." Their conversation was cut off by a low creak of floorboards near the bar. Clara followed their gaze, her breath catching in her throat. The man standing at the counter towered over the rest of the patrons, his broad frame cloaked in a dust-worn coat. His hat sat low over his forehead, shadowing most of his face, but a single flicker of lamplight illuminated the sharp angle of his jaw, the unruly strands of dark hair peeking from beneath the brim. He was different from the others in the room. Not rowdy, not boasting, just still. Her gaze drifted lower, to the scar that cut from his left temple to the ridge of his cheekbone, stark against his weathered skin. Garrett Calloway. She knew it was him before anyone said his name. A cold, heavy silence settled over the saloon as if the very air shifted at his presence. No one called out a greeting. No one offered him a seat. Instead, men side-eyed him with wary respect, shifting in their chairs as though his lower existence made them uneasy. Clara's heart thudded against her ribs. The barkeep slid a glass toward him. Calloway picked it up without a word, tossing back the contents in a single swallow. He didn't grimace, didn't flinch, just set the glass down with a slow, deliberate movement. And then he looked at her. It was the barest flicker of movement, just a slight lift of his chin, his gaze sweeping over her in a brief, unreadable glance. Something in that moment sent a strange shiver down her spine. Not fear, something else. Then, just as quickly as he'd acknowledged her, he turned away. Without a word, he pushed off the counter, tugged his hat lower, and strode for the door. The heavy wooden panels swung shut behind him, and the room seemed to exhale all at once. Someone murmured under their breath. Another man shifted in his seat. Clara forced herself to breathe. She didn't know much about Garrett Calloway, but something told her she hadn't seen the last of him. Chapter 2. A Proposition. Clara sat rigid in the wooden chair across from Mrs. Hawthorne's desk, her gloved hands folded neatly in her lap, despite the frustration coiling in her chest. The schoolhouse, though simple, had a sturdy build, its walls lined with wooden shelves stacked with well-worn books. A small potbelly stove crackled in the corner, struggling against the bitter February cold that seeped through the drafty windows. Mrs. Hawthorne didn't seem the least bit concerned with the chill. The schoolma'am's grey woolen dress was buttoned up to her throat, her silver hair twisted into a severe bun, and her sharp blue eyes narrowed with expectation. Clara had barely been in Bismarck a full day, but already she sensed that refusing Mrs. Hawthorne was a fool's errand. "I assume you are up to the task, Miss Winslow." The older woman's tone was clipped, brooking no argument. Clara straightened. "I have every intention of fulfilling my duties as schoolteacher, ma'am, but I was under the impression that my role was to educate the children within the town limits." Mrs. Hawthorne tapped a thin stack of papers on the desk, her mouth pursing. "Tobias Ellis is an exception. Clara glanced at the name scrawled in ink. Tobias Toby Ellis, age 10. His father, Frank Ellis, runs a homestead about 6 miles west of town, Mrs. Hawthorne continued. Toby should be in school. But the boy is difficult. Wild as a coyote and stubborn as a mule. His father's given up trying to force him. If you don't teach him, Miss Winslow, he won't be taught at all. Clara lifted her chin. Every child deserves an education. Glad to hear it. Because I'll warn you, this will not be an easy task. The boy refuses to sit still, barely reads beyond the Bible, and has scared off every teacher before you. Clara's lips twitched. Then he hasn't met me yet. Mrs. Hawthorne's thin brows lifted in faint amusement. You've got spirit, I'll give you that. But spirit won't get you to the Ellis homestead. The trail is rough, the land unpredictable. You'll need a guide. The small triumph Clara felt wilted under the hard reality of frontier life. The road to the homestead would be treacherous snowdrifts, hidden creeks, and the ever-present danger of bandits and wild animals. And while she had learned to ride back in Boston, she had never traversed the open plains alone. Clara swallowed her pride. Who do you recommend? Mrs. Hawthorne sighed, setting the papers down. There aren't many I trust. But if you want a man who knows this land better than any other, there's only one choice. Clara waited, sensing the reluctance in the woman's voice. Garrett Calloway. The room seemed to grow colder, the crackling of the stove suddenly too quiet. Garrett Calloway. The brooding rancher she'd glimpsed at the saloon the night before. The man whispered about in hushed voices, scarred inside and out by the past. A man who had ignored her presence outright. Clara stiffened. I gathered from town gossip that Mr. Calloway isn't exactly sociable. Mrs. Hawthorne's lips flattened. That's putting it lightly. But he's the best horseman in the territory, and he knows every inch of the prairie. If you're to reach the Ellis homestead safely, he's your best bet. Clara hesitated. The thought of being at the mercy of a man so closed off, so hardened by misfortune, made something uneasy coil inside her. But what choice did she have? She had come all this way for a fresh start, to prove that she wasn't just some fragile society girl. She could do this. Lifting her chin, she met Mrs. Hawthorne's gaze. Then I suppose I'll have to convince Mr. Calloway. The schoolma'am's expression didn't soften. Good luck, Miss Winslow. You'll need it. The Calloway Ranch sat on the outskirts of Bismarck, beyond the gentle sprawl of farmlands and pastures where cattle dotted the frozen landscape. The house itself was modest but sturdy, built from rough-hewn logs, with a corral to the side and a weathered barn that had seen better days. The place looked as lonely as the man who lived there. Clara pulled her borrowed cloak tighter around her shoulders as she swung down from her borrowed mare, her boots crunching in the fresh snow. The air smelled of wood smoke and horse, and the only sound was the occasional restless huff of a gelding inside the barn. She knocked on the door, firmly but not hesitantly. Silence. She tried again. More silence. Clara frowned. She knew he was here. A wisp of smoke curled from the chimney, and a set of fresh boot prints in the snow proved someone had walked to the barn not long ago. When no answer came, she muttered under her breath and marched toward the barn instead. Inside, the smell of warm hay and horses wrapped around her, a stark contrast to the icy wind outside. Several saddles were lined up against the wall, tack carefully maintained, and 2 massive workhorses peered at her curiously over their stalls. And there he was, Garrett Calloway. He stood at the far end of the barn, leaning over a workbench, oiling the stock of a rifle. His broad back was to her, his dark coat dusty with trail dirt, his sleeves rolled to his forearms, revealing strong, work-roughened hands. Mr. Calloway. He didn't look up. Whatever you want, I ain't interested. Clara stiffened. She hadn't even stated her purpose yet, and already he was shutting her out. She lifted her chin. Mrs. Hawthorne sent me. I need a guide to the Ellis homestead. I ain't a guide. His tone was low, gruff. No, you're a rancher, she said, stepping closer. One who, according to Mrs. Hawthorne, knows this land better than anyone else. Still, he didn't turn. He simply picked up a clean cloth, rubbed it along the barrel of the rifle, slow and methodical. Find someone else. Clara exhaled, patience thinning. I was told you were the best. Or has Mrs. Hawthorne misjudged your abilities? That made him pause. Slowly he straightened and turned to face her. The dim barn threw shadows across his features, but it didn't soften them. Dark stubble lined his jaw, his scar cutting a pale ridge from his left temple to his cheekbone. His grey eyes were as unreadable as slate, a storm brewing behind them. "Lady," he said at last, his voice like gravel over stone, "you don't know what you're asking." Clara folded her arms, refusing to be intimidated. "I'm asking for help. That boy needs an education, and I can't teach him if I can't reach him." He gave a dry chuckle, though there was no humor in it. "That's Mrs. Hawthorne talking." "And what if it is?" she shot back. "Is it such a terrible thing to care about a child's future?" His jaw tightened, a flicker of something pain, regret, crossing his expression so quickly she almost missed it. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, rattling the barn's walls. One of the horses stamped a hoof in its stall. Finally, Garrett exhaled sharply and set the rifle down with a deliberate motion. "Ain't my problem, Miss Winslow." "But it could be," Clara pressed, "if you weren't so determined to shut out the world." A muscle ticked in his jaw. "That why you came all the way out here?" he asked coolly. "To tell me how I ought to live my life?" Clara lifted her chin, refusing to shrink away. "No, I came here because I need a guide. But now I have to wonder why a man with your skills would rather sulk in the middle of nowhere than use them to help someone." Something in his grey eyes darkened. For a long, tense moment she thought he might tell her to leave. Instead, he turned back to the workbench, palming a whetstone and running it down the length of a knife. "I ain't changing my mind." Clara swallowed her frustration. She had expected him to be rough around the edges, but this level of stubborn isolation, she hadn't been prepared for that. She was about to cut her losses and leave when a firm voice called from the barn doors. "She's not going anywhere, Calloway." Both of them turned as Mrs. Hawthorne stepped inside, her boots kicking up dust. The older woman leveled Garrett with a knowing look, hands clasped in front of her heavy wool coat. Garrett's gaze narrowed. "You sent her here, didn't you?" Mrs. Hawthorne arched an eyebrow. "Of course I did. You're the only man who can get her to Ellis's place safely." He folded his arms. "Ain't my responsibility." Miss Hawthorne sniffed. "You owe me a favor." Garrett's scowl deepened. Clara glanced between them, sensing a long history that neither of them was willing to explain. Mrs. Hawthorne stepped forward, lowering her voice. "It's one trip, Garrett. Get the girl to the Ellis place, make sure she don't freeze to death, and be done with it." Clara held her breath. For a moment she thought he might refuse again, but then Garrett exhaled heavily, rubbing a hand over his face as if he were already regretting this. "Fine," he muttered. "One trip. No more." Mrs. Hawthorne smiled in that triumphant way of a woman who always got her way. Clara, however, wasn't smiling, because as Garrett turned his storm-grey gaze to her, something in it made her stomach tighten. She didn't know whether she had won a battle or just signed up for something she wasn't prepared for. Chapter 3. The Journey. The first rays of pale dawn stretched across the horizon as Clara Winslow tightened her grip on the reins of her borrowed mare, already cursing the stubborn man riding ahead of her. Garrett Calloway hadn't spoken a word since they set out, save for a curt keep-up when he'd nudged his stallion into motion. Now, his broad-shouldered frame cut an imposing figure against the vast expanse of snow-dusted prairie, his long duster flaring slightly with each gust of wind. Clara's mare, a patient old thing named Maisie, plodded along at a steady but frustratingly slow pace. She tried nudging the horse into a faster gait, but each time she did, Garrett's stallion, a sleek black beast with restless energy, would prance impatiently ahead, making the gap between them widen. Clara gritted her teeth. "Are you always this agreeable?" she called ahead, exasperation creeping into her voice. Garrett barely glanced over his shoulder. "I don't make conversation when I ride." Clara scoffed. "Is that a rule you made up yourself, or do all cowboys abide by such nonsense?" Garrett sighed, low and weary, as though he regretted every decision that had led to this moment. "You talk too much." She let out a short, disbelieving laugh. "Well, excuse me for wanting to exchange pleasantries while we trek through a frozen wilderness together." The wind howled across the open plains, sweeping whirls of frostbitten grass across the narrow trail. Clara shivered, adjusting her wool cloak around her shoulders. She hadn't expected it to be this cold. The sky was vast and endless, tinged with the soft pink of early morning, but the land itself felt unyielding, wild and untamed, just like the man riding ahead of her. They rode in silence for a while. The only sounds the steady clop of hooves and the occasional chirp of a lone prairie bird, breaking the quiet. It was beautiful in a way that made Clara feel small. She had grown up surrounded by brick buildings, carriages, and the polite murmur of city life. Out here, the world stretched on forever, and there was nothing between them and the horizon except the elements and whatever dangers lurked beyond sight. Garrett finally spoke, though his voice was laced with irritation. "You ain't sit in the saddle right." Clara glanced at him, frowning. "I most certainly am." "No," he said flatly. "You're bouncing too much. You'll be sore in an hour." Clara huffed. "Well, forgive me if I haven't spent my life on horseback." Garrett sighed again, the kind of long-suffering sound a man makes when he wishes he were anywhere else. "Loosen your legs. Let the horse move beneath you instead of fighting her every step." Clara muttered under her breath, but followed his instructions. To her surprise, the ride did feel a bit smoother after a few minutes. He glanced at her again, watching her adjust. Then, with what might have been the faintest twitch of approval, he turned his focus back to the trail. They rode on, the sun climbing higher, the air crisp and sharp with winter's lingering bite. Clara didn't need to be warned that this land was unforgiving. The very air held a sense of isolation, as though nothing out here belonged to civilization. Movement in the distance caught her attention. "Garrett," she called, reining in slightly. "Is that buffalo?" he said before she could finish, his voice unreadable. Sure enough, a herd of massive, shaggy beasts lumbered along the horizon, their dark forms shifting through the prairie grass like phantoms from an older time. The sheer size of them sent a chill through Clara. They were enormous, primal, as though untouched by the march of progress. She exhaled in quiet awe. "They're beautiful." Garrett's expression didn't change, but there was a flicker of something understanding, maybe before he looked away. "They're dangerous if you get too close. I wasn't planning to run over and introduce myself," she said dryly. That earned her the barest huff of amusement. Not quite a laugh, but closer than anything she'd gotten out of him so far. Still, his guard remained firmly in place. The wind picked up again, and Garrett nudged his stallion forward. "Storm be coming in by nightfall. We need to move faster." Clara sighed. "Then stop riding ahead like I'm not here and let me keep up." Garrett cast her a look, one that was equal parts exasperation and reluctant amusement, before slowing his pace just enough for her to ride beside him. It wasn't much, but it was something. And as the wilderness stretched endlessly before them, Clara couldn't shake the feeling that this journey would change everything, for both of them. The sky had shifted. Clara noticed it first in the way the wind turned sharp, a sudden bite in the air that cut through her wool cloak like a blade. The clouds, once stretched thin and wispy across the horizon, had thickened into a low, brooding mass, their color darkening to the hue of iron. Garrett noticed it too. He reined in his stallion, his sharp gaze scanning the sky, his expression unreadable but decidedly not pleased. "Storm's coming in faster than I thought." Clara followed his gaze, gripping her reins as a gust of wind kicked up dust and brittle grass. "How bad will it be?" "Bad," he said bluntly. That one word sent a chill curling down her spine. She had read about the brutality of Dakota Territory storms, how they could descend without warning, their icy winds swallowing whole landscapes, turning the land from treacherous to deadly in mere minutes. Garrett turned his horse toward the west. "There's a trapper's cabin up ahead. If we're lucky, it's still standing. And if we're not," his jaw tightened. "We keep riding and hope the horses don't go lame in the cold." A fresh gust of wind whistled through the open plains, rattling the few leafless trees nearby. Clara clenched her teeth, swallowing her response. They didn't have a choice. The cabin in the storm. By the time they reached the abandoned trapper's cabin, the first flakes of snow had begun to fall, thick, wet ones, the kind that promised hours of relentless winter ahead. The structure was weathered, leaning slightly against the force of the wind, but it still stood, the roof intact and the door only slightly askew. Garrett dismounted without a word and strode forward, pushing the door open with a single sharp shove. The hinges groaned in protest. Clara followed hesitantly, stepping into the dim, musty interior. The cabin was little more than a one-room shelter, with a rusted stove in the corner, and a splintered table, and a pile of straw that might have once been a mattress. Garrett moved quickly, assessing their surroundings with practiced efficiency. He bent near the stove, running a gloved hand over the iron, then stood and tested the roof with an appraising glance. "It'll hold," he murmured. Then, louder, "Get that saddlebag off your horse. We're staying here for the night." Clara hesitated, peering out the doorway. The world had already faded into white, the storm consuming the prairie in long, sweeping curtains of snow. She swallowed and nodded. "All right." By the time she returned, struggling slightly under the weight of the saddlebag, Garrett had already set to work building a fire. Garrett's survival skills, it was mesmerizing watching him. Garrett moved with calm certainty, his every motion precise and efficient. He stripped off his wet gloves, revealing strong, work-roughened hands, and struck flint against steel with quick, practiced movements. Within seconds, the kindling caught, flickering to life. The fire crackled and spilled warm, golden light across his face, highlighting the angles of his jaw, the sharp lines of his cheekbones, and the faint shadow of stubble that darkened his skin. Clara shivered not just from the cold. He glanced up. "Come closer before you freeze." She didn't argue, sinking onto the floor near the warmth. The heat was an immediate relief, thawing the numbness in her fingers. She watched as Garrett pulled off his coat, his shirt damp from the wet snow. He shrugged out of it, leaving only the thin underlayer clinging to his broad shoulders. Clara looked away sharply, her face flushing despite the cold. She busied herself instead by untying the food parcel from her saddlebag, but her fingers fumbled with the knots, stiff from the icy air. Garrett noticed. Without a word, he reached over and covered her hands with his own. Clara froze, her breath catching. His palms were warm, solid, calloused from years of hard work. His touch was gentle but firm, steadying hers. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. His gaze met hers, grey, unreadable, but piercing all the same. Then, just as quickly as he had reached for her, he let go. "Next time, wear thicker gloves," he muttered, turning back to the fire. Clara exhaled shakily, her heart pounding against her ribs. She wasn't sure what had just passed between them. But she knew one thing. Garrett Calloway might be a hardened, isolated man, but there was something beneath that gruff exterior. Something raw. Something he didn't want to show. And for the first time since they left Bismarck, Clara wondered who exactly had hurt him so badly that he had become this closed-off, solitary man. She might not have all the answers yet. But the storm wasn't the only thing that had begun to shift. Chapter 4. Trapped in the blizzard. The wind had teeth now. Sharp, biting, relentless. Clara gritted her teeth as she urged her mare forward, but the poor animal fought every step, the snow piling higher, swallowing the narrow trail that Garrett insisted was there. She could barely see through the white fury swirling around them, her eyelashes thick with frost. Her fingers, despite her gloves, were numb and clumsy, the chill creeping up her arms, sinking into her bones like a vice. Somewhere ahead, Garrett rode with that unshakable certainty, his black stallion moving through the storm as though it were just another nuisance to push through. He didn't hesitate, didn't falter. Even with the wind slashing at their coats and howling like a beast, he simply rode on. Clara didn't have his endurance. The cold had settled in her chest, making it hard to breathe, every exhale a painful puff of frost. Her limbs felt heavy, uncooperative, sluggish. She hadn't realized she was falling behind until she heard his sharp voice cut through the storm. "Clara." She tried to answer, but her lips were too cold, too stiff to move properly. She barely heard him over the howling wind. Then, suddenly, he was there. Garrett wheeled his horse around and rode straight to her, his sharp gaze flicking over her in an instant. "Damn it," he muttered under his breath. Before she could protest, his gloved hands gripped her waist and lifted her off the saddle. The world tilted violently. For a moment she thought she might fall. then strong, steady arms wrapped around her. She felt warmth, the steady thump of a heartbeat, and the muscular firmness of his chest as he pulled her against him. "Stay awake, Clara." His voice was gruff, urgent. She wanted to argue, but the exhaustion was too much. The cold had taken too much. Her head lolled against his shoulder, and the last thing she remembered before everything went black was the deep, rhythmic gallop of his stallion beneath them and the sound of his voice, low, steady, unyielding, murmuring something she couldn't quite understand. Garrett's ranch Clara woke to the crackle of firelight and the smell of pinewood smoke. For a moment she couldn't place where she was. The last thing she remembered was the storm, the wind stealing her breath, the bitter cold sinking into her skin. Now she was wrapped in blankets, layers of warmth pressing down on her. A soft pallet of furs beneath her cushioned her stiff body, and then she saw him. Garrett sat near the hearth, his long legs stretched out, arms folded across his broad chest. The firelight cast deep shadows along his jawline, flickering over his storm-grey eyes as he watched her with an unreadable expression. "You're awake," he said finally. Clara tried to sit up, but the stiffness in her limbs protested. "Where?" "My ranch." He shifted, leaning forward to pour steaming liquid from a tin pot into a cup. Storm hit hard. "We were lucky to make it." Her fingers trembled as she reached for the cup he handed her. The first sip burned, but in the best way, the heat spreading through her like sunlight after a long winter. "You passed out on the trail," he said after a long silence. Frostbite hadn't set in yet, but you were damn close. Clara swallowed. "You carried me." His jaw flexed, as if the very idea of discussing it irritated him, seemed the better option than letting you freeze to death. Her heart twisted at that, not just because of what he had done, but because he made it sound so practical, as if saving her hadn't been a choice at all. She watched him from beneath her lashes, taking in the tense set of his shoulders, the tight line of his mouth. "I suppose I should thank you," she murmured. His gaze flicked to hers, unreadable, searching. Then, with a small shake of his head, he simply said, "Get some rest." And for the first time since arriving in Dakota territory, Clara didn't argue, because for the first time she felt safe. Clara woke to the scent of wood smoke and something rich and savory simmering nearby. She blinked against the dim glow of firelight, the rough-hewn ceiling beams above her coming into focus. The weight of heavy blankets cocooned her, a stark contrast to the biting cold she barely remembered from the night before. She shifted, wincing at the dull ache in her limbs. Everything felt heavy, sluggish, as if the cold had burrowed into her bones and refused to let go. The movement must have caught his attention, because suddenly he was there. Garrett Calloway sat in a wooden chair near the fire, his long legs stretched out before him, arms crossed over his broad chest. He didn't say anything at first, just watched her, his grey eyes shadowed beneath the brim of his hat. "You're awake," he finally muttered. Clara swallowed, her throat parched. "So it would seem." "Here." He reached for a tin cup resting on the hearth, then leaned forward, offering it to her. She pushed herself upright, the blanket slipping down to pool at her waist. The sudden shift made the world tilt sideways, and before she could stop herself, her balance wavered. Garrett was faster than she expected. One strong arm reached out, steadying her, his palm warm against her forearm. "Easy," he murmured, his voice gruff but oddly gentle. "You were half frozen when I found you. You ain't got your strength back yet." Clara stilled, her pulse fluttering unexpectedly. It was absurd, really, how the simple weight of his hand against her skin made her breath catch. With a brusque movement, he pulled away the second she steadied herself. "Drink," he ordered, thrusting the tin cup into her hands. Clara took a sip, the warm broth sliding down her throat, sending heat through her stiff limbs. Silence settled between them, thick and weighted, broken only by the crackle of flames and the howl of wind against the cabin's walls. After a long moment, she cleared her throat. "How long will the storm last?" Garrett's gaze flicked toward the frosted-over window, his jaw tightening. "Weeks, maybe." Her fingers clenched around the cup. "Weeks. Snow's too deep to ride through," he said flatly. "Even if it lets up, you wouldn't make it back to town without getting lost." Clara exhaled, pressing her lips together. She hadn't planned for this, hadn't expected to be trapped in the wilderness with a man who barely tolerated her presence. As if reading her thoughts, Garrett leaned back in his chair, stretching his legs out once more. "Reckon you'll just have to make do." She shot him a sharp look. "I'm not some helpless damsel, Mr. Calloway." His mouth twitched, almost like he wanted to smile, but then the storm-grey eyes darkened again, shutting her out. "I didn't say you were," he muttered. Something unspoken stretched between them, something thick with tension and uncertainty. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. But then again, nothing about Garrett Calloway had ever been predictable. And as the storm howled like a living thing outside, Clara had the sinking feeling that the real danger wasn't the blizzard. It was him. Or rather, the way her heart tripped over itself when he looked at her like that, like he wasn't quite sure what to do with her. And she wasn't quite sure what to do about that either. Chapter 5. Clashing understanding. Clara wasn't raised to be idle. Her mother had often scolded her for refusing to let the housemaids handle things back in Boston, but Clara had always felt an itch to contribute, to be useful. And now, trapped in Garrett Calloway's isolated ranch with the storm raging outside, that itch had become unbearable. She wasn't about to sit around like some fragile ornament while he carried the weight of their survival alone. So at the first opportunity, she bundled herself in her cloak, stepped into the chilly barn, and rolled up her sleeves. She barely made it past the first pile of firewood before his voice barked across the yard like a rifle shot. "What in the hell do you think you're doing?" Clara straightened, the log still clutched stubbornly in her arms. She turned to face Garrett, who stood in the doorway of the barn, arms folded, his expression dark as a thundercloud. She lifted her chin. "Helping." He exhaled a sharp breath, clearly already at the end of his patience. "That ain't help." "I beg to differ." She shifted the firewood higher against her chest. "Unless you'd prefer we freeze." Garrett stalked toward her, his long strides eating up the distance between them in seconds. "Ain't about freezing. It's about the fact that your soft city hands ain't made for this kind of work." Clara stiffened. Soft city hands? His grey eyes flicked pointedly to her gloved fingers, and then to the logs in her arms. "That wood's heavy, Clara. You'll be sore in an hour, and by tomorrow you'll be useless." She bristled. "I am not useless." Garrett let out a low growl, swiping the firewood from her arms with a swift, easy motion. "You don't belong out here." That stung more than she cared to admit. But instead of backing down, Clara squared her shoulders, refusing to let him chase her off so easily. "I don't belong in a parlor, either," she shot back. "Or sipping tea while some maid does my bidding. You don't know me, Mr. Calloway. And I won't sit around and let you pretend I'm some wilting flower." He stilled, something flickering behind his stormy gaze. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, with a sigh that sounded almost like defeat, Garrett turned and strode toward the barn, dumping the firewood in its proper place. "Fine," he muttered. "If you're hell-bent on working, you can mend things instead of breaking yourself in half trying to play ranch hand." Clara crossed her arms. "Like what?" Garrett jerked his chin toward the corner of the barn where a tattered brown duster hung from a nail. The entire left sleeve was ripped, the fabric barely hanging on. She arched an eyebrow. "Did you wrestle a bear?" Garrett shot her a look. "Barbed wire." She smirked. "Could have been a bear. Just fix the damn coat, Clara." And with that he strode off into the storm, leaving her alone with the firewood, the coat, and the very distinct feeling that she'd won something even if she didn't quite know what. Mending more than just fabric inside the cabin. Clara sat by the fire, needle and thread in hand, carefully stitching the torn sleeve back together. It was a quiet kind of work, the kind she didn't mind the rhythm of the needle pulling through fabric, the flickering warmth of the fire. It reminded her of nights back home when she used to sew beside her grandmother, listening to the old woman tell stories about love and loss, and the way life never quite went as planned. She was so lost in thought that she didn't hear Garrett enter until he dropped an armload of wood beside the hearth. His gaze flicked to the coat in her lap, his expression unreadable. Clara didn't look up, simply continued her work, her fingers deft and sure as she tied off the final stitch. "There," she held it up, turning it toward the firelight. The seam was sturdy, the stitches clean and strong. "Good as new." Garrett hesitated before stepping forward. He took the coat, turning it over in his hands, running his fingers over the freshly mended fabric. For a moment, he said nothing. Then, in a voice so quiet she almost missed it, he muttered, "You did a good job." Clara blinked in surprise. Not because she doubted her ability, but because she hadn't expected him to say it. He met her gaze then, something less guarded in his expression, something uncertain. It lasted only a second before he cleared his throat and shrugged back into the coat, as if the moment had never happened at all. "Storm's still got a ways to go," he muttered, moving toward the fire. Clara watched him for a moment longer before turning back to her sewing kit, a small smile tugging at the corner of her lips. She hadn't just mended his coat. She'd chipped away at something harder. And for the first time since the storm had trapped them here, Garrett Calloway didn't seem quite so unreachable after all. The storm still raged outside, wind howling through the trees, rattling the cabin walls like a restless spirit. Inside, however, the fire burned warm and steady, casting a soft golden glow against the wooden beams, chasing the shadows into the corners. Clara sat at the rough-hewn kitchen table, her fingers curling around the warm ceramic of a tin cup, steam rising from the tea Garrett had grudgingly brewed. The silence stretched between them, not tense like it had been before, just quiet, settled. Garrett sat across from her, his broad shoulders hunched slightly as he speared a bite of venison stew, the soft flicker of firelight accentuating the sharp angles of his face. Clara hesitated before speaking, weighing her words. "Boston feels a lifetime away," she said at last, stirring her tea absently. Garrett didn't look up, but she knew he was listening. He always was, whether he wanted to admit it or not. "What made you leave?" His voice was gruff but not unkind. Clara exhaled slowly, her fingers tightening around the cup, gathering the courage to speak. "I was engaged." She let the words settle between them. "To a man my parents chose." Garrett's fork stilled against his plate. She continued, voice even, but laced with something old and bruised. He was the kind of man every Boston mother wanted for her daughter. Wealthy, well-mannered, well-connected. She lifted the cup to her lips, taking a slow sip. "I thought I could love him." Garrett finally looked up then, grey eyes unreadable, but intense, focused. "And," Clara set the cup down carefully, "and I realized I would spend the rest of my life suffocating under his expectations, that my own dreams, my own ambitions meant nothing to him. He didn't want a wife. He wanted a fixture. A silent, agreeable woman to stand beside him, to make him look good at dinner parties, to host grand gatherings in a house I had no say in choosing." A wry, bitter smile pulled at her lips. "I was an accessory, not a person. And I was foolish enough to believe he loved me." Garrett didn't say anything for a long moment. Then he murmured, almost absently, "Did he hurt you?" Clara blinked at the unexpected question. "No," she admitted, startled by his concern. "Not physically," she traced the rim of her cup. "But he hurt me in other ways. He made me doubt myself, my worth. He made me believe that a woman's only purpose was to be someone's wife, someone's possession." She lifted her gaze to meet his. "I left before the wedding." Garrett's jaw ticked slightly, but he gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "Your folks must have raised hell," he said. Clara let out a soft, humorless laugh. "You have no idea. My mother nearly fainted. My father called me selfish, told me I'd thrown away the only good future a woman could have." She sighed. "I packed my things that night and never looked back." Garrett studied her for a long moment, then exhaled deeply, rubbing a hand over his face. "You were brave," he said gruffly. Clara arched a brow, surprised. "Brave? Some would call it foolish." His gaze flickered with something unreadable. Sometimes foolish and brave looked the same. She let his words settle, warmth blooming in her chest in a way she hadn't expected. Then she tilted her head. "What about you, Mr. Calloway?" His spoon paused mid-air, his fingers tightening slightly around it. She watched as something in his expression darkened, his usual guarded walls locking back into place. He didn't answer right away. But then, in a voice so quiet she barely heard it over the crackling fire, he said, "My family's gone." Clara's breath hitched slightly. Garrett set his spoon down, staring at the flames instead of her. "My pa had a ranch down in Texas. Good land. Hard land. His jaw flexed, as if forcing himself to continue. I used to say I was born in the saddle. I reckon she was right. Clara stayed silent, sensing how hard this was for him. Garrett exhaled roughly, shifting in his chair. A fever hit. Took my ma first, then my sister, but lasted another few months. But he swallowed. He didn't much care to keep going after that. Clara's chest tightened at the stark, quiet grief in his voice. She understood now. Why he lived out here alone. Why he kept the world at arm's length. Why he scowled more than he spoke. Why he looked at people like he wasn't sure if they were real or ghosts. Garrett, she began softly, unsure what to say. He shook his head, as if shaking off the past. It was a long time ago. Clara reached for her cup again, searching for something to say, something that wouldn't sound empty or foolish. Finally, she murmured, "I'm sorry." Garrett glanced at her then, and something shifted between them, something quiet but deep, a shared understanding that went beyond words. They were both running from something, both trying to build a life out of the ashes of what they'd lost. And for the first time since she'd arrived, Clara realized something important. Garrett Calloway wasn't just a gruff, brooding cowboy who had no use for people. He was a man who had loved deeply and lost everything. And maybe, just maybe, he was more like her than she'd ever imagined. Chapter 6. Growing Affection. The storm had passed, but the world outside still bore its frozen scars. Snow lay thick along the prairie, glittering beneath the winter sun, the sky a pale, clear blue. Garrett had barely spoken that morning, save for a few gruff instructions while he saddled the horses. Clara knew better than to take it personally. Silence was his way. "You're still sitting wrong," he muttered, as she adjusted her position on the saddle. Clara exhaled sharply, shifting again. "I don't see how. I'm sitting just fine." Garrett sighed, rubbing a gloved hand over his jaw. "You're stiff. You keep trying to control the horse too much. Let the saddle move with you." She frowned, gripping the reins tighter. "If I let the horse have all the control, I'll end up face first in a snowdrift." One side of his mouth quirked slightly, not quite a smile, but dangerously close. "A good rider don't fight the horse, Clara." Before she could argue, he rode up alongside her, closing the space between them. "Here," he murmured. Then, without warning, he reached out and slid his hands to her waist. Clara sucked in a breath, her entire body going still. Garrett adjusted her posture with deft, confident hands, his fingers strong and warm even through the thick fabric of her coat. "Relax," he said, his voice low, close. Relax? How could she possibly relax with him touching her like that? His fingers lingered a second too long, his warmth seeping through her layers, his scent a mix of leather, wood smoke, and something uniquely him surrounding her. Clara swallowed hard, her pulse skittering wildly. Garrett's hands slowly pulled away, his fingers grazing her side as he straightened. She turned her head slightly, meeting his gaze. The air between them changed. Something unspoken, heated, crackled like a slow-burning flame, warming the cold space between them. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then, with a curt nod, Garrett cleared his throat and reined his horse back. "Try again." Clara exhaled shakily, refocusing on her posture, even though her heart was still galloping wildly beneath her ribs. Later that afternoon, Garrett was brushing down his stallion when he heard her voice from inside the barn. "You poor thing," Clara murmured softly. Curious, he turned toward the sound. She was kneeling beside a chestnut mare, her gloved hands gently running over the horse's foreleg. Garrett frowned, stepping closer. "What are you doing?" Clara didn't look up. "She's favoring this leg. I think it's swollen." He watched as her fingers, gentle but firm, traced over the mare's ankle, checking for heat, her brow furrowed in concentration. "She must have slipped on the ice," she continued, her voice softer now, soothing. "She needs a poultice." Garrett crossed his arms. "You know how to make one?" Clara finally looked up, arching a brow. "You think I spent my whole life sipping tea and embroidering? I grew up around horses." Something flickered in his expression, surprise, maybe even a little admiration. Clara smirked slightly before turning back to the mare. "I can help, you know. If you'd let me." Garrett hesitated, then exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. "You're going to do what you want anyway, ain't you?" She grinned, and damn if something in his chest didn't tighten at the sight of it. "Now you're learning," she teased. Later that evening, as the sun dipped behind the horizon, casting the sky in deep purples and golds, Garrett stood outside the barn, watching Clara as she carefully wrapped the mare's leg with a poultice. She was focused, determined, her breath fogging in the cold air. Garrett knew he should look away, but he didn't. Instead, he watched the way the firelight from the cabin flickered across her face, highlighting her delicate features, the loose strands of hair curling against her cheeks. She was beautiful. Not in the fancy, painted way of the city women he'd known in his younger days, but in the unspoken, natural way that crept up on a man when he wasn't paying attention. When Clara finally looked up, their eyes met, and for a brief, reckless second, the world felt smaller. Neither of them spoke. They didn't have to. The tension between them was thick, electric, like the charged air before a summer storm. Then Clara blinked, breaking the spell, and turned back to the horse, as if she hadn't felt it too. Garrett let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding and forced himself to look away. This was dangerous, because if he wasn't careful, he'd end up wanting something he had no business wanting, and that was a risk he wasn't sure he was ready to take. The wind had settled to a whisper, brushing against the cabin walls like a lullaby. The fire in the hearth had burned low, leaving behind a soft golden glow, flickering shadows dancing along the wooden floorboards. Clara sat awake, wrapped in a quilt on the edge of the chair near the fire. She had tried to sleep, tried to still the restless energy humming in her chest, but the cabin was too quiet, and her thoughts were too loud. Then, in the dim glow of the room, she noticed it. A piano. The instrument sat half forgotten against the far wall, its polished wood dulled by dust, its keys hidden beneath a cloth. She hesitated for a moment before slipping from her seat, her bare feet barely making a sound as she crossed the room. Lifting the cloth, she ran her fingers over the keys, feeling the cool ivory beneath her touch. It had been a long time since she'd played, years, maybe. Back in Boston, there had always been someone listening, someone critiquing, waiting for her to hit a wrong note. But here, there was only the wind, the crackling fire, and maybe, for the first time in a long while, the freedom to simply play. So she did. The first few notes were tentative, a little stiff, but as her fingers remembered, the melody began to flow, a soft, lilting tune, something half forgotten but still lingering in the corners of her mind, a song her mother had once hummed on rainy afternoons. She closed her eyes, letting the music wash over her, filling the quiet cabin with something soft, something warm. She didn't notice the shadow moving near the doorway, didn't realize she was being watched. Not until she finished the last note and turned only to find Garrett Calloway standing there, watching her. Clara startled, her pulse skipping a beat. She hadn't heard him move, hadn't even realized he was awake. He stood at the edge of the firelight, his broad shoulders tense, his expression unreadable. But his eyes, those storm-grey eyes, held something different, something almost haunted. "Did I wake you?" she asked softly. Garrett shook his head, stepping into the room. "No." His voice was low, roughened by sleep. "I just ain't heard music in a long time." She studied him, tilting her head slightly. "You have a piano, but you don't play." He let out a short breath, almost a laugh, but there was no humor in it. "Ain't much use for music when there's no one left to listen." Clara's chest tightened at his words. She had learned enough about Garrett by now to know he carried ghosts with him, and those ghosts, it seemed, were still whispering in the dark. Without thinking, she shifted on the bench, patting the empty space beside her. "Play something." Garrett blinked at her, clearly caught off guard. Don't lie," she teased gently. "A man doesn't keep a piano if he doesn't know how to play it." His mouth twitched, almost into a smile. But still, he hesitated. Clara softened her voice. "Please, Garrett." Something in his expression wavered, just for a moment. Then, slowly, almost warily, he stepped forward and lowered himself onto the bench beside her. For a long moment he didn't move. Then, finally, his fingers, roughened from years of ranch work, of gripping reins instead of ivory keys, pressed a single note, then another. A slow, deliberate melody began to take shape beneath his touch. Clara watched his face, the way his brows furrowed in concentration, The way his fingers moved, hesitant at first, then steadier, more sure. And then he hit the wrong note. The sound was so comically off-key, so completely unexpected, that Clara couldn't help it. She laughed. Not a polite, measured laugh. A real, honest-to-goodness belly-deep laugh. Garrett scowled at the piano. Damn thing's out of tune. Clara laughed harder, covering her mouth with her hands, her shoulders shaking. It's not out of tune. That was just awful. Garrett turned his glare on her, but there was no real heat to it. You want to do better, sweetheart? She smirked. I already did. He gave her a long, slow look, then before she could react he reached over and played the worst, most discordant set of notes she had ever heard. Clara gasped in mock horror, pressing her hands over her ears. Garrett Calloway, you are ruining that poor instrument. He grinned, then a real full smile, one that crinkled the corners of his eyes, one that made something inside Clara go warm and soft. You started it, he drawled. She swatted his arm playfully, still laughing. You are impossible. His smile lingered for a moment before fading into something quieter. Something almost intimate. Clara felt it too, the shift, the weight of something neither of them had meant to stumble into. She swallowed, her pulse quickening as she held his gaze. Garrett cleared his throat and looked away first, rubbing a hand over his jaw. You should get some sleep, he muttered, standing. Clara watched him go, her laughter still lingering in the space between them, the warmth of his presence still settling in her bones. And as the door to his room clicked shut, she realized something. Tonight, for the first time, Garrett Calloway had smiled, and she had been the reason why. Chapter 7. Danger in the Snow. The wind had picked up again, an icy whip across the snow-covered plains, rattling against the cabin walls. Inside, the fire burned steady, casting a warm glow against the wooden beams. But it did little to chase away the unease settling in Garrett's gut. Something felt wrong. He knew it before the first knock pounded against the door hard, urgent. Garrett's instincts sharpened instantly. He set down his coffee, hand automatically resting near the rifle propped against the wall, and exchanged a glance with Clara, who had looked up from the sewing in her lap, her brows drawn. Another knock, louder this time. Garrett crossed the room in a few strides and threw open the door. A man staggered inside, half frozen, snow caked in his beard. His coat torn. His chest heaved from exertion, his breath misting the air in short, ragged puffs. Garrett immediately recognized him, Jed Simmons, a trapper who lived a few miles east. Damn it, Jed, Garrett muttered, already reaching for the pot of coffee on the stove. What in the hell are you doing out in this weather? Jed shook out of his coat, his fingers trembling as he accepted the hot cup Garrett shoved into his hands. Trouble, he managed between gulps. Big trouble, Calloway. Garrett felt Clara move behind him, lingering near the fire. He could tell she was listening carefully. Jed looked up, his expression grim. Outlaws, he said, voice thick with exhaustion. Been ridden through, hit in homesteads. Took everything from the Douglas family, burned their barn to the ground. They're heading west. Fast, Clara gasped softly, her hand flying to her mouth. Garrett's stomach hardened. How many? He asked, his voice steady, controlled. 5, maybe 6, Jed rasped. Armed. Mean as hell. Garrett cursed under his breath. Snow made men desperate. Winter was harsh, supplies scarce. Some men took to stealing to stay alive. Others did it because they could. And if these outlaws had burned down the Douglas place, that meant they weren't just after food or supplies. They wanted blood. Clara, to her credit, didn't pale or panic. She straightened, stepping forward. We have to warn the town. Garrett whipped around to face her. No, she lifted her chin stubbornly. We can't just sit here. Garrett scowled. It's too dangerous. I can ride, she shot back. You know I can. That ain't the damn point, Clara. His voice came out harsher than he intended, frustration coiling tight in his chest. Her blue eyes flashed. You think I don't understand the risk? Garrett ran a rough hand through his hair, exhaling sharply. Of course she understood, but that didn't make it any less infuriating. Garrett. Her voice softened just enough. If we don't warn them, more families could be hurt. Killed. His jaw clenched. Because she was right. But the thought of her out there, alone, riding into danger, it made something inside him twist so violently it damn near took his breath away. Finally, he turned back to Jed. "You well enough to ride?" Jed nodded sharply. "Give me 10 minutes. Garrett looked at Clara again, his expression hard. "You are not going alone." A flash of triumph flickered across her face, but she quickly masked it. Garrett grabbed his coat, his rifle, and strapped his gun belt around his waist. Because if anything happened to her, if she was taken, if she was hurt, he'd never forgive himself. Never. The snow had thickened, making visibility difficult as they rode hard toward town. Garrett's stallion moved swiftly through the drifts, Clara's mare struggling to keep pace but holding steady. Jed lagged slightly behind, still recovering from his ordeal. The wind whipped at their coats, stung at their exposed skin. Garrett stole a glance at Clara, who was leaning forward in the saddle, gripping the reins tightly. Determined. Fearless, stubborn as hell. Something hot and sharp twisted in his chest. She wasn't just some city woman playing at frontier life. She was strong. Fierce. Brave. And, damn it all, she was his, even if neither of them had spoken the words aloud yet. As they crested the last hill overlooking Bismarck, Garrett prayed they weren't too late, because if those outlaws were already in town, there would be hell to pay. Chapter 8. A Desperate Gamble. The wind cut through them like a blade, sharp and unforgiving as Garrett and Clara raced toward town. Snow churned beneath their horses' hooves, a thick white sheet swirling across the prairie, making it nearly impossible to see more than a few yards ahead. Garrett rode ahead, his jaw clenched, pulse hammering, his body tensed for trouble. Clara was just behind him, her mare struggling to keep up in the deep drifts, but she never slowed. Stubborn woman. Fear gnawed at him, but he couldn't let it show. They had to make it. Bismarck was still miles away, and if those outlaws were headed west, that meant every family between here and town was in danger. Clara leaned forward in the saddle, her breath coming in short, visible puffs. "How much farther?" "Few miles," he shouted over the wind. "Stay close to me." She nodded, her blue eyes filled with determination. Garrett had no time to admire her grit, because that was when he heard it. A sharp, deadly whistle through the air. A bullet. It struck the frozen ground beside them, kicking up a spray of snow and ice. Garrett yanked his rifle from the saddle holster, his heart pounding. "Go, Clara." Now, before she could react, a second gunshot cracked the air. Her mare screeched in panic, rearing up violently. Clara barely managed to stay in the saddle, her gloved hands clutching at the reins as the terrified horse twisted beneath her. Garrett wheeled his stallion around, his sharp gaze cutting through the blizzard, their dark figures moving between the trees. The outlaws. They'd been waiting for them. Garrett barely had time to think before the first rider charged out of the trees, pistol raised. He fired first. The outlaw jerked violently in the saddle, then toppled backward, hitting the snow with a sickening thud. But there were more of them. 3, maybe 4. "Clara, ride," Garrett bellowed. "Get to town." But Clara didn't move. Instead, she swung her rifle free, her hand steady despite the sheer terror on her face. Garrett cursed, firing again. Another outlaw went down, but a third had already drawn on him. The crack of a gunshot split the air. Pain seared through Garrett's shoulder, hot and merciless. He gritted his teeth, refusing to fall, refusing to show weakness. He aimed, fired, and the last outlaw dropped into the snow, his body motionless. Then silence. The snow continued to fall, eerily peaceful despite the bodies now littering the ground. Garrett swayed in the saddle, his vision swimming. A soft, panicked voice cut through the haze. "Garrett, Clara." Then she was there, slipping from her horse, stumbling toward him. Her hands caught at his coat, steadying him as his body threatened to fall sideways. "You're shot," she gasped, her gloved fingers already pressing against the wound. Garrett grunted, his legs barely holding him up as he slid from the saddle. His knees hit the snow hard, and suddenly Clara was the only thing keeping him upright. Her face was pale, stricken but determined. "You're not dying, Garrett Calloway," she said fiercely, her voice shaking. "Not after everything." Garrett almost smiled, despite the pain. Damn, she was something else. Clara pressed a cloth firmly against Garrett's shoulder, her hands slick with blood, her heart hammering. The tiny abandoned cabin they had found was barely standing half-rotted walls, a dirt floor, but it was shelter. "Stay awake," she ordered, kneeling beside him. Garrett gritted his teeth, sweat beading on his brow. "You always boss this much?" Tears burned her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. "Yes," she snapped, adjusting the bandage she had torn from her own petticoat. "And you're going to listen to me for once." Garrett let out a weak chuckle, then winced. Clara's throat tightened. The thought of losing him, really losing him, made something twist painfully inside her. She had known him only a few short weeks, but in that time he had become everything. The stubborn, guarded man she had argued with, laughed with, learned from. And damn her heart, but she needed him. Her hands trembled as she pressed against the wound again. Garrett's grey eyes flickered open, hazy but focused on her. "You're worried," he murmured, his voice rough. Clara swallowed. "Of course I'm worried." A slow, pained smile touched his lips. "Didn't think you'd care that much," she exhaled shakily. "Well, I do." His gaze softened. For a moment it was just the two of them. The wind outside, the flickering firelight, the space between them shrinking into something dangerous, something fragile. Clara's hands curled into his coat, her heartbeat hammering. She should move away. She should say something light, something dismissive. But instead she whispered, "You scared me, Garrett." His eyes darkened, his gaze dropping to her mouth. Slowly, painfully, he lifted a hand and brushed a stray curl from her cheek. "I'm all right," he murmured. Her breath caught. Because for the first time she could see it. The wall between them wasn't as strong as he wanted it to be. And neither of them could pretend any more. Chapter 9. The Breaking Point. The fire had burned low, casting long, flickering shadows against the rough cabin walls. Outside, the storm had eased to a whisper, the wind no longer howling in fury, but sighing through the trees. Inside, the silence was heavier than the air before a storm. Clara sat beside Garrett on the edge of the makeshift pallet, her fingers still stained with his blood, her heartbeat too loud in her ears. She had almost lost him. That thought, that horrible, gut-wrenching thought, had taken root inside her, curling like a vine around her ribs, making it impossible to breathe. Garrett shifted, a pained grunt escaping him as he tried to sit up. "Don't," she whispered, reaching for him before she could stop herself. "You need to rest." He stilled beneath her touch, his grey eyes unreadable as they searched her face. Something changed between them in that moment. Something deep, something dangerous. Clara swallowed hard. She should move away. She should create space between them, say something light. Break the moment before it swallowed her whole. But she didn't. Because for the first time since meeting Garrett Calloway, she could see the truth. He was breaking. Not in the way that meant weakness. No, Garrett Calloway was too strong for that. But in the way that meant he could no longer pretend. No longer pretend that he didn't care, that she didn't matter. His hand came up slowly, hesitantly, and when his fingers brushed her cheek, Clara sucked in a breath. The calloused warmth of his touch sent a shiver through her, her pulse skipping like a stone across a river. His gaze dropped to her lips. Clara stilled, the world narrowing to nothing but this. Garrett exhaled sharply, a sound of surrender. And then he kissed her. It wasn't a polite kiss. It wasn't soft or slow or careful. It was raw, desperate, the kind of kiss that came from a man who had spent too long denying himself. Garrett's hands tangled in her hair, pulling her closer, as if he could no longer fight the need to touch her. His lips claimed hers, rough and warm, tasting of heat and longing, and something else, something broken. Clara melted into him, her hands grasping at his coat, her breath lost somewhere between them. She had never been kissed like this, never been touched like this, not like she was something precious, but like she was something necessary. A warmth unfurled inside her, spreading through her like wildfire, burning away the fear, the hesitation, the doubt. She wanted this. She wanted him. And just when she thought he might pull her closer, just when she thought she might drown in him completely, Garrett tore himself away. He stumbled back, breathing hard, his expression twisted in something too raw to name. Clara reached for him without thinking. Garrett, no. The word was sharp, final, full of regret. He turned away from her, his shoulders tense, his hand raking through his already messy hair. This can't happen. Clara felt as if he had slapped her. Her chest tightened. Why not? Garrett exhaled, his voice rough. Because you deserve better. She stared at him, her heart cracking at the edges. That's not your choice to make. His jaw clenched, his back still turned. It is. A lump rose in Clara's throat. She had never seen him like this, so vulnerable, so lost. You don't get to decide what I want, Garrett. He let out a humorless laugh, shaking his head. You think you know what you're saying, Clara, but you don't. I ain't the man you need. She stood then, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. Why? She challenged. Because you've been hurt before. Because you think you don't deserve happiness. His breath hitched, barely audible. Clara took a step closer. You saved my life, Garrett. He turned to her then, his eyes filled with so much pain it nearly stole her breath. And I almost lost you today, she whispered, voice thick. His gaze darkened, his fingers twitching as if he wanted to reach for her again, but wouldn't allow himself to. That's why, he said hoarsely. Clara frowned. What? That's why this can't happen. His voice broke over the words, rough and uneven. Because if I lose you, Clara, I don't think I could survive it. Her breath shook. Garrett Calloway, the unbreakable man, was afraid. Not of her. Not of what they felt. But of what it would mean to love her. Clara's chest ached. She wanted to fight him on this, to tell him he was wrong. That love wasn't something you ran from. But he was already stepping back, putting space between them, building walls between them once more. His next words were soft, almost broken. I'm sorry. Then he turned and walked away, leaving Clara alone with the ache in her chest, the taste of his kiss still lingering on her lips, and the sinking realization that she had just fallen in love with a man too afraid to love her back. Chapter 10. The Climb Back Up. The streets of Bismarck bustled with life, but Clara felt none of it. She sat by the window of the small boarding house parlor, staring at the snow-covered town square, watching people go about their day, merchants unloading supplies, a mother guiding her child through the slush, a man tipping his hat as he greeted a neighbor. It was a world she should fit into. A world where things made sense, where life followed a steady rhythm of expectations and obligations. But all she felt was hollow. Clara tightened her grip around the steaming cup of tea in her hands, but the warmth did nothing to chase away the cold inside her. She had been here for 2 days, 2 endless, miserable days since she had ridden into town with Jed, and the news of the outlaw attack. The townsfolk had been grateful, offering her a warm bed, fresh food, and plenty of polite conversation. She had smiled, nodded, said all the right things. But inside, something inside her ached in a way she had never known before. She missed him. The realization came slowly, creeping over her like the dawn's first light. She missed his gruff voice, his quiet presence, the way his eyes softened just barely when he let his guard down. She missed the warmth of the fire in his cabin, the way he worked with his hands, the way he had watched her so intently that night she had played the piano. And more than anything, she missed feeling like she belonged. Not to a town, not to society, but to him. The truth settled deep in her chest, solid and unshakable. Garrett Calloway was her home, and she was done running from it. Clara slammed the cup onto the saucer, startling the elderly woman sitting across from her. Are you all right, dear? The woman asked, her brow wrinkling in concern. Clara smiled, breathless with the weight of her decision. Yes, I am. Then she stood, gathered her coat, and walked straight out of the boarding house. The wind rushed against her face, but she didn't care. Clara rode fast and hard, her mare kicking up snow as she galloped across the frozen prairie. The sun had begun its descent, casting a golden glow over the horizon, but she didn't slow. Garrett's ranch was still miles away. But she felt lighter with every hoofbeat, every breath of crisp air filling her lungs. She had been a fool to leave, to let fear, his and her own, convince her that she could walk away from what they had begun to build. Garrett had kissed her, and then he had pushed her away, not because he didn't want her, but because he was afraid of losing her. And if Clara knew anything about Garrett Calloway, it was that he had spent too many years running from the things that could break him. Well, she wasn't going to let him run anymore. She wasn't some fragile thing he needed to protect from himself. She was his, and she was going to fight for him. The moment Clara saw the familiar outline of his cabin against the darkening sky, something in her chest tightened. It felt like coming home. The plume of smoke curling from the chimney was the first sign that he was inside. His horse, tethered near the barn, was the second. Her heart pounded against her ribs as she pulled her mare to a stop, her breath coming in quick bursts, but she didn't hesitate. She swung off her horse, strode straight to the door, and knocked once firmly, decisively. Silence. Then the sound of bootsteps. The door swung open, and there he was. Garrett stared at her, his expression unreadable, his grey eyes dark with something she couldn't quite name. Clara's pulse jumped. She opened her mouth, but before she could say a single word, he whispered Clara. And just like that, she knew. She had made the right choice. She was exactly where she was meant to be. Garrett sensed it before he saw it. A shift in the wind. A stillness in the air that wasn't natural. The kind of silence that only came before a storm. Or before a fight. He was at the barn when it happened, brushing down his stallion, but the instant he heard the distant thunder of approaching hooves, his body went tight with awareness. He stepped outside, his grey eyes narrowing as he scanned the horizon. Then he saw them. 5 riders, their dark figures cutting through the twilight, moving fast across the frozen prairie. The outlaws had returned. Garrett didn't hesitate. Clara. His voice was sharp as he strode toward the cabin, his mind already calculating how much time they had. Get inside. The door flew open before he reached it. Clara stepped out, rifle in hand, her face set in stubborn determination. No. Garrett stopped short. His pulse kicked hard. Damn it, Clara, this isn't a discussion. She lifted her chin. I'm not running, Garrett. He cursed, glancing over his shoulder. The riders were closer now, their silhouettes dark against the snow. Time was running out. Garrett turned back to her, his jaw tightening. I ain't letting you get hurt. I'm not letting you fight alone. The fierceness in her voice nearly undid him. But there wasn't time to argue, because the outlaws were here. The battle for their home, the first gunshot rang out, slicing through the cold air. Garrett shoved Clara behind him, lifting his rifle in one fluid motion and firing. The shot struck its mark, knocking the lead rider back with a sharp grunt before he toppled from his horse into the snow. 1 down. But the others kept coming. Clara ducked behind a water trough, steadying her breath, aiming at one of the riders circling toward the barn. She fired. The outlaw jerked, clutching his arm, and his horse bucked wildly, sending him sprawling to the ground. Garrett stole a quick glance at her. Damn if he wasn't proud. But there wasn't time for that now. Another rider flanked them from the side, firing wildly. The bullet whizzed past Garrett's shoulder, embedding itself into the post behind him. Garrett swung his rifle around, aiming fast. Bang. The man slumped forward in the saddle, his grip on the reins loosening before he slid to the ground. Another down. But just as he turned, a 4th outlaw rushed him from behind, knocking him off balance. Garrett hit the ground hard, the impact knocking the breath from his lungs. The outlaw was on him in an instant, fists flying, landing a blow to Garrett's jaw that sent pain shooting through his skull. Clara screamed his name. Garrett growled, fighting through the pain, twisting his body and throwing the man off. They grappled in the snow, the outlaw grabbing for a knife at his belt. Before Garrett could react, a gunshot cracked through the air. The outlaw stiffened, his eyes wide with shock before slumping, lifeless, onto the snow beside him. Garrett sucked in a breath, whipping his head around. Clara stood there, her rifle still raised, her breath coming hard and fast. She had saved his life. For a split second, time stood still. Then, the last remaining outlaw, realizing he was outnumbered, turned his horse and bolted. The fight was over. Garrett pushed himself to his feet, shaking off the pain, and turned toward Clara. She was still gripping the rifle, her hands trembling now that the battle had ended, her blue eyes locked on his. She had fought beside him. She had refused to run, and she had saved him. Something inside him broke wide open. He crossed the space between them in 2 strides, grabbing her, pulling her against him, holding on like she was the only real thing left in the world. Damn you, Clara Winslow, he murmured, his voice hoarse with emotion. She let out a half laugh, half sob against his chest. "You're welcome." Garrett Calloway. He pulled back just enough to look into her eyes, and for the first time in his life, he stopped fighting what had been there all along. Chapter 11. The happy ending the morning after the attack. Bismarck came alive with talk of the fight at Garrett Calloway's ranch. Word had spread fast how Clara Winslow and Garrett had held off the outlaws, how she had stood beside him, fought beside him, refused to abandon him. By midday, riders arrived from town, men with rifles slung over their shoulders, ready to finish what had been started. The remaining outlaws had been found, captured, or driven out for good. Garrett watched it all in silence, standing at the porch of his cabin, his rifle still within reach. He had lived too long expecting trouble. Now that it was over, he didn't quite know what to do with himself. Beside him, Clara leaned against the railing, watching the last of the town's riders disappear over the ridge. "They said you'll be a hero in town," she murmured. Garrett scoffed, shaking his head. "Don't much care for that." Clara smiled softly, tilting her head to look at him. "Then what do you care for?" Garrett turned toward her, his heartbeat loud in his ears. She had stood by him. She had saved him. And she was still here. His chest tightened. "You should be going back to town." Her brow furrowed. "And why would I do that?" "You belong there," he muttered, staring at the horizon. "With people. A real home." He felt her shift beside him, and then soft, warm fingers brushed against his. "Garrett." He swallowed hard, his pulse kicking up. "Do you really think I could go back to town after everything?" she asked gently. Garrett kept his jaw tight, unwilling to meet her eyes. She squeezed his hand. "I'm not leaving you." That broke something inside him. Garrett let out a slow, shaky breath and finally turned toward her. She was looking at him the way no one ever had before. Like he was worth something. Like he was home. And Lord help him. But he couldn't fight it any longer. His hands came up to cradle her face, his calloused thumbs brushing her soft skin. "You sure about this?" His voice was hoarse, like the words had been dragged from deep inside his chest. Clara's blue eyes shone with something fierce, something unshakable. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life." Garrett gave up, gave in. And then he kissed her. This kiss was different from the first. Not desperate. Not fueled by fear or the weight of what could have been lost. This one was steady, strong, unbreakable. It was a promise. When he pulled back, Clara smiled, her fingers tracing the edge of his jaw, her touch as natural as the sunrise. "I love you, Garrett." His heart stilled. Then kicked hard against his ribs. No one had ever said those words to him. Not like that. Not when he needed to hear them most. His throat tightened, his hand sliding down to curl around her waist. "Say it again." She laughed softly, her breath warm against his cheek. "I love you." Garrett swallowed hard. "I love you too." The words tasted foreign on his tongue, but they were true. So damn true. Clara rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady thump of his heart. He had spent so many years fighting, surviving, pushing people away. But Clara had walked straight into his life, into his heart, and refused to leave. And now he wasn't letting her go. Garrett took a slow breath, his arm tightening around her. He had thought he didn't deserve love, didn't deserve happiness. But Clara had proven him wrong, and he was done fighting it. As the wind swept gently over the prairie, carrying the scent of fresh snow and pine, Garrett pressed a kiss to Clara's forehead and finally let himself believe in forever. Spring came soft and slow, like a whisper on the wind. The prairie, once frozen and unforgiving, had thawed beneath the golden sun, giving way to rolling fields of wildflowers and tall green grass that danced in the breeze. The sky stretched wide and endless above them, a brilliant shade of blue, unmarred by storm clouds or bitter winds. Life had returned to the land. And so had love. Garrett stood on the front porch of the cabin, his worn hands resting against the wooden railing, his grey eyes scanning the land before him. It looked different now, softer, warmer. Not just because of the season, but because of her. Clara Winslow Calloway. His wife. The thought still sent something fierce and undeniably tender through his chest. She was his now. Not because he had claimed her, but because she had chosen him. And that was something he would never take for granted. The cabin door creaked open behind him, and he felt her before he saw her, the warmth of her presence, the scent of lavender drifting on the morning air. "You're up early," Clara said, stepping beside him, her cheeks pink from the cool dawn. Garrett glanced at her, unable to stop the slow, easy smile that pulled at his lips. "So are you." She gave him a knowing look. "I don't sleep well when you're not beside me," he grunted, tipping his hat back. "That so?" Clara rolled her eyes, but he caught the teasing spark in her gaze. She stepped forward, resting her hands on the railing, looking out over the land. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" Garrett followed her gaze, taking in the way the wildflowers stretched toward the horizon, the way the early light bathed everything in gold. He wasn't much for poetry, but standing there with Clara beside him, the ranch thriving, and a future stretched wide open before them, yeah, it was damn beautiful. Clara turned to him, her expression softer now. "You ever think about what's next?" Garrett exhaled slowly, reaching for her hand. His calloused fingers laced through hers, holding tight, grounding them both. "I used to think about the past more than the future," he admitted. "You didn't see much ahead worth looking forward to." Clara squeezed his hand. "And now?" He looked at her then, really looked at her, his strong, stubborn, beautiful wife, the woman who had fought for him, fought beside him, and refused to let him push her away. Now he saw everything. Garrett lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a slow, reverent kiss to her knuckles. "Now I got everything I need." Clara's eyes shone with unshed tears, but she smiled radiant, breathtaking. She reached up, brushing a stray lock of hair from his forehead, her fingers lingering. "I love you, Garrett Calloway." He felt that love settled deep inside him, warm and unshakable. "I love you too, Clara." No hesitation, no fear, just truth. And as the prairie wind swept gently around them, carrying the promise of new beginnings and endless love, Garrett knew one thing for certain. He would spend the rest of his days loving this woman, no matter what. Epilogue. A new chapter. Spring had settled gentle and golden across the Dakota Territory, its warmth breathing life into the land, into the town, into the people who had long endured its hardships, and into him. Garrett Calloway stood at the edge of the schoolyard, his arms crossed, leaning against the freshly painted white fence, watching the woman who had changed everything. Clara. His wife, his heart, his future. She stood near the schoolhouse, her laughter as light as the prairie breeze, surrounded by a handful of children, their bright, eager faces turned up toward her as she handed out slates and books. A teacher. A wife. A frontier woman. His woman. Garrett had never pictured a life like this one, where his mornings began with Clara's soft kiss and the sound of his child's laughter, where the weight of solitude and loss had been replaced with something whole, something steady. He had spent so many years believing that happiness was for other men. That love, a home, a family, those things weren't meant for him. But Clara had proved him wrong, and she had given him the greatest gift of all. A soft giggle tugged his attention downward, and he barely had time to react before tiny hands grabbed onto his pant leg. "Papa." Garrett's heart twisted, full and aching, as he bent down and scooped up the squirming bundle of warmth. Lillian Calloway. His daughter. His beautiful, stubborn, wide-eyed little girl with Clara's bright smile and his steel-grey eyes. She curled her chubby arms around his neck, her soft curls tickling his jaw as she pressed a sloppy kiss to his cheek. "I helped Mama teach today," she announced proudly, her tiny fingers gripping his collar. Garrett chuckled, his chest tight with a love so fierce it nearly brought him to his knees. "That right, sweetheart," he murmured, shifting her in his arms. "You learn your letters yet?" Lily nodded so seriously, her little nose scrunching. "Aha! Mama says I'm very smart." Garrett smiled, pressing a kiss to her forehead before glancing back at Clara, who had stopped to watch them. Their eyes met across the schoolyard. A breeze stirred through the grass, lifting the loose strands of her golden brown hair, and for a long moment, the rest of the world faded. She knew how much he loved her, knew how she had saved him, knew that every single day he thanked whatever force had brought her into his life. A slow, knowing smile curved Clara's lips. Garrett shifted Lily in his arms, tipped his hat back, and gave his wife the look that had started everything, the same quiet, reverent intensity that had been there since the first time he laid eyes on her. "I love you," he mouthed. Clara's smile deepened, her blue eyes shining. "I love you too." And just like that, everything was right. The wind swept across the plains, whispering its approval, carrying the scent of wildflowers and sun-warmed earth. A love story written not in the pages of a book, but in the untamed beauty of the West. And it was only the beginning. The end.